Okay. Ezekiel. I was kind of hoping to teach it last week and be done in about 10 minutes of talking about it, because Ezekiel's crazy town. I think it's the craziest of the prophets. He's asked to live out and do a lot of stuff. And he does a good job in the video of showing some of that stuff. We'll look at that in a little bit. But Ezekiel, I think Ezekiel's hard to understand. And I find that it's challenging, if not more challenging, even than Isaiah and Jeremiah, to read and to follow and see and just try to figure out. As we look at some of the key facts, most people believe that the author was indeed Ezekiel. He had a pretty long period of ministry, from about 593 to 571 BC, so for about 22 years. He had different visions and different things that he spoke to the Israelites. He was speaking to the Jewish exiles in Babylon. He was actually moved to, if you remember, there's the first exile where they took the leaders and key families to Babylon, but they didn't destroy the city. There was still a king there in place that had there was a king in theory in place, but had an answer to Nebuchadnezzar, but he kept pushing back against Nebuchadnezzar, and eventually they came in and they destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. So he would have been in exile, and that's actually one of the turning points of the book, because he's warning them in exile about the upcoming judgment of God. So he's speaking to the Jews that were in exile, the first group of Jews, and the second group, Jewish exiles in Babylon. The key word is glory, and just the glory of the Lord. And again, on the video, does a good job of explaining what glory means in Hebrew and what that means. And so I won't talk about that much. But the key word is glory. And then the key verse is Ezekiel 8:4. I saw the glory of the Lord, of the God of Israel there, like the vision I had seen in the plain. And so I saw the glory of the Lord of Israel there, like the vision I had seen in the plain. It's referring back, that's in chapter 8. So when he talks about the one he sees in the plain, it's referring back to the first vision that he had seen. Ezekiel's name literally means God has strengthened. And so his name is God has strengthened. And so he was taken into exile. He actually received his call on his 30th birthday. When I first read that, I thought it said 13th. I misread it. And but it was on his 30th birthday. And it was, now here's the deal in Jewish culture. It's a great book. You got somebody that's getting ready to raise teenagers, or has just raised teenagers, or in the middle of raising teenagers. There's a great book by David Allen called The Myth of Adolescence. And it's basically, you know, the term adolescence was never used until the 1950s. This whole idea of how we treat teenagers as teenagers in adolescence is like a whole different stage of life, is completely a Western concept developed in the last 60 years. Historically, you were considered a young adult at 13. What event do we know of? Well, what do we call that in Jewish tradition? They have a what? Bar mitzvah. Right? Jesus went to the temple when he was what? 13, right? That's his young adulthood. And so the idea is to start training people to be adults when they're 13. Not to give them a pass to go to college and do whatever they want to do, go wild, and then grow up when they come home. The idea is, actually, biblically, is when you're 13, start giving kids adult responsibilities. And we fuss about our kids, by the way, a lot of times, but we fuss about this new generation not being responsible. What are we doing as the older generation to give them responsibility to help them grow? Just throwing that out there. Even at the church, what can we do? I think we need to look at how we can get our kids more involved in serving at the church. Anyway, and then your main adulthood comes when you're 30. He's going to talk about the 30s when you officially became a priest. Was when you turned 30. And so your first adulthood is when you're 13. Begin your adulthood. Young adulthood starts at 13 and goes until you're 30. And then you're considered a full-grown man when you're 30 years old. By the way, when did Jesus start his ministry? When he was about 30 years old. And so just biblically in Jewish culture, historically, that's how that came about. And so that's what David Black's book's on, is what do we do between 13 and 30. And so it's an interesting book, interesting concept on how to deal with our kids. Anyway, so that's 30s when he was called, it was his 30th birthday. Ezekiel, he came from a priestly family, so he was a priest. He was about to be called to be a priest when he was 30 years old. And that also explains some of his emphasis on the sin of uncleanliness and defilement, right? Because that's what the priests did. They offered sin to help people be clean and to be non-defiled. There's three major sections of the book. First 24 chapters are the judgment of Judah and Jerusalem. He's just like, so from the time he turns 30, his first number of years, it's just judgment's coming. Judgment's coming. And he does all the crazy things. He has to, one of the things that he has to do, the one that I always thought was the craziest. So he lays for a year, he lays on his side. And all the food that he eats is cooked on dung beside him. So he has to cook all his food on dung, and that's the only thing he eats for a year. And it was to symbolize the siege that was going to come to him. And there's a couple of the craziest things. That's the one I always hated. I do think it's interesting, by the way. I still say there's humor in the Bible when you look for it. And God basically said, use human dung to make your fire for your food. And he goes, can I at least use animal dung? And so he used animal dung for a year to make all of this food. And because you can burn it. And anyway, he says all kinds of crazy things. And then God tells him when he's getting ready to do all these crazy things, nobody's going to listen to him. By the way, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they're not going to listen to him. Our job is to spread the gospel and help build people up, whether they listen to us or not. I mean, here's two guys, tough ministries, and both of them were told at the beginning, hey, this is what you're going to say, nobody's going to listen, but do it anyway. Then it gets to, so there's the judgment of Judah and Jerusalem, then it's the judgment of the nations, some of the smaller nations, and then Egypt, and there's one other one that I'm drawing a blank on right now, but not Babylon. Babylon's not addressed, but the judgment of the other nations. And then, as most of the prophetic books are, I mean, it's hammer, the grace of God. And chapters 33 through 48 deal with the restoration. So, first part of the book is judgment of Judah and Jerusalem. The second part of the book is the nations. And the last part is the future restorations. A couple things to think about when we do Ezekiel. Again, a lot of visions. It's very much more picture. I won't say picturesque because that gives the wrong connotation. There are more pictures and more illustrations and more visuals in Ezekiel than the other prophetic books within his oracles. And again, presented over 24. And then the same thing with Defeat and Stewart. They say the same thing, 1 through 24. 5-year period before the siege of Jerusalem. When you get to the end of that part, they tell them about the siege. Then you get 25 to 32, surrounding nations. And then 33 to 48 is the hope again. Structure of the book helps to reflect a lot of the structure helps to reinforce the theology of Ezekiel. His God's holy, Yahweh's holy wrath against his people, their idolatry. That again, the big sin in the Old Testament is idolatry. And so it's God's judgment. Called you as my special people. You continue to rebel. You continue to worship false gods. And so that's why they deserve the judgment that they had. Second part is like Yahweh is sovereign God over all the nations. So you get that in the second part of the book. It's not just Jerusalem and Judah, but God's sovereign over all the nations. So they too will experience their idolatry or experience judgment because of their idolatry. And even they begin to think they're gods. And so there's punishment for that. And then third, Yahweh. So that's again, book structure, theology is Jerusalem, Jews were idolatrous, they deserve judgment. Other nations are idolatrous, they deserve judgment. So what's going to be the third part? Restoration, right? It's going to be hope. So the third part is Yahweh is a God of mercy and compassion who intends to restore his people and be present with them once more. So the same way the book's set up, same way it shows the theology that he's really trying to push. A couple of specific things for reading Ezekiel. Again, just like Jeremiah, you want an idea of the framework of what's going on historically and what's going on around him. Again, born of a priestly form so he was born actually before the reforms of Josiah. So he would have lived through that last little good period of time before things turned its darkest. Because right, remember, who was the worst of the kings? What? Manasseh is correct. So Manasseh is the worst of the kings. His son By the way, why was he the worst of the kings? Because he actually set up a false god in the temple. Yeah, right. I don't know who was that. That's right. That's bad. That's the worst. That's the worst. That's the worst one. When you put a false god in the temple, and so that's what God said. Okay, that's it. Nothing. And then Josiah had these great reforms, even as a young kid, and so there was a little mini period of prosperity there. But the stage had been set, and by the way, his sons were crazy wicked, and so they ended up being destroyed. But that's so it started. He was there during the last little good blip. Would have been alive during that, but then saw the fall of Jerusalem. Over the span of Ezekiel's life, Judah's king made several bad political choices and struggles between Egypt and Babylon over supremacy. So basically, Israel a lot of times tried to use Egypt to help them, and that never goes well. And so they were trying to use the Egyptians to fight against the Babylonians. That didn't go well, and that's when the Babylonian king finally just came in and said, nope. And he finished destroying Israel. Nebuchadnezzar eventually seized Jerusalem. The prominent people, including Ezekiel's family, were taken to Babylon again. That's the first one. And then later they come back and destroy the rest of the city. Lying at the heart of the things was the theology to which both Ezekiel and the people were committed. So here's where Ezekiel and the people kind of agreed, but they had different views of what it meant. So here's what Ezekiel and the people of Israel kind of agree on this, but how they view it and what it means are different to them. And that is the idea. The people of Israel are Yahweh's people. Right? So Ezekiel believes that they're Yahweh's people. All the people that are not listening to him believe that they're Yahweh's people. Created and redeemed by him, and ultimately defined by their place, the land, and especially Jerusalem, right? That was the place. That was God's selected land they had promised. And by Yahweh's presence, the temple, because the temple was the ultimate symbol of God's presence with him, right? So we agree on that. So Ezekiel and everybody agreed on that. They were God's chosen people, that Jerusalem was special, and the temple particularly was special. But Ezekiel also understood that Israel was defined by place and presence. He also recognized that Judah had failed to keep their covenant with Yahweh, and thus they forfeited the land, right? God took the land from them, and they forfeited God's presence. Where the people thought, Ezekiel saying, we need to live up to this, and God's taken it away because of our sin. And the people are saying, well, no, we're so special, no matter what we do, God's going to always protect us. Remember the battle where it was when Joshua and them were going, was it Joshua? No, it was under Saul. It was under Saul when they were fighting the Philistines, and they took the ark with them, saying, well, we take the ark, then they can't take the ark. And, because we got the ark, we can't lose because it's God's presence, right? It's not just that it's God's presence, that you have to still, even in the right place, you have to be living like God wants you to live. And that's what Ezekiel was trying to tell them. It's not just the place. It's not just the bloodline. It's about being faithful to God. One of the reasons that Ezekiel's also different is that he spoke his oracles primarily in prose rather than poetry. Now, our Bibles don't necessarily show it very well, like in Isaiah, but Isaiah is almost all poems. The majority of what Isaiah is, there's some historical narratives in there, but there's a lot of poems in poetry in Isaiah. And Ezekiel is pretty much prose. He doesn't do a lot of the poetry. In fact, I like this quote. Ezekiel's like entering into a verbal picture book as one prophetic word after another comes either in the form of a symbolic action or his part, or as a vision or an allegorical picture, some of which are also interpreted. So there's just a lot of picture imagery in the book of Ezekiel. We want to make sure that we're looking for other features that are also unique to Ezekiel. Again, one of those is just his perspective and the importance he places on the temple, and then also the priestly thing, which makes sense, right? Because he was what? He was a priest, so that would be what he was concerned about. I'm just going to read this next line because I just like it. This is the other reason I think Ezekiel's hard to read. His tendency to be repetitive may at times be burdensome to the modern reader. But for Ezekiel, it was a way of reinforcing what he saw and reported. So it's going to be, I try to, like I'm doing the 3-year reading plan. We're not to Ezekiel yet. We'll get there in a little while. But we're in Isaiah right now. But when we get to Ezekiel, it's one of the reasons I don't, dread's the wrong word, but I know it's going to be a tough slog. Because I try to write 2 or 3 lines of something, like what did I get out of this passage, what God's trying to say to me, just kind of not an exegetical, but just a devotional kind of what can I learn about God from this passage. And when it's the same thing over and over, it is extremely difficult. I've said, and I promise y'all will not hear me preach through the book of Galatians. I'll preach sermons from Galatians. I am not preaching through the book of Galatians ever again in my life. I did it once. And the entire book of Galatians is, salvation is by faith, not of works. And then you get to the next passage. Galatians is by faith, not of works. And then it's living for God is by faith and not of... I guarantee you, I was so out of illustrations for salvation by faith and not living by works. I don't know that there's another illustration in this world that I didn't look up and use when I did Galatians. So I think Galatians is the repetitive part. Anyway, the repetitive part like Ezekiel for that. But that's the same thing with Ezekiel. It kind of repeats, and it's going to hammer home the message. But that's why you repeat something, right? You repeat something so that it'll stick. By the way, there's an old preacher story, the pastor story that's told that said this pastor comes in, and well, the 2. And one was this pastor comes in, he preaches the same sermon, exactly the same sermon 6 weeks in a row. His congregation goes, "Why are you preaching the same thing?" Because when you start living that out, I'll move to the next one. And then the other thing that I tell you as a pastor is based on Nehemiah, that you really want to repeat the things that are most important in your theology within every 52 days, or every 52 days, or every 32 days, because people forget. It's just people tend to. You just got to keep reinforcing. I guarantee you, safety guy. I bet y'all had to just continue the basics of safety, right? You just keep hammering the same principles over and over, and just try to show it a different way. Curtis used to be over training for safety for ROL, and I knew a lot. But that's what you have to do teaching guys, right? It's not you're not changing.
Draw awareness.
Yeah, you just got to keep bringing up the same things. Finally, you'll meet Ezekiel's words and ideas when they come to the New Testament. Especially, so the 2 places you see them most, Paul's letter and then in John's Revelation, there's a lot of common illustrations. And it makes sense because Ezekiel's very prophetic. When you get to the hope ultimately for Israel, and then John, the book of Revelation, is the same way. So Curley and Phillips and Ayers, when they talk about the 2 key themes, they had 2. One was the temple, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. They have talked about some, we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But also God's sovereignty. And that's ultimately what Ezekiel is trying to say. God is sovereign. He's in control of what's happening. Live for God. God's going to restore judgment because you've sinned. You deserve this. He's going to make the case that you've sinned, but God's sovereign and control, and we are His. Israel is His chosen nation, and there is I believe biblically correct, that there is a future for Israel in God's plan. We don't know what that is, when that'll happen, but I believe there is, because God's what? Faithful to His promises. And God is sovereign and in control. Purpose is a message to the first exiled Babylons that they had rejected God. So when they first go, it's like you've rejected God. Continued rejection led to more destruction. But after the future restoration, after the future destruction, it turned to Israel's future restoration, and again, very much dealing with the Messianic kingdom beyond just returning back from Israel. Now there is a long section when you read through the Pentateuch, right, and you get to the details of the temple. Do you ever read the details of the temple and the Pentateuch and just kind of go, right, because the curtains are this and the rock? Well, when you read through Ezekiel, here he comes again. It's very detailed terms. So the challenge is, when is that temple going to be built? You had the first temple that was built by Solomon, right? But it was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then you had the second temple that was rebuilt, right? That's the one we read about. God says, get back, start working on the temple. It's not going to be as great as it was, but rebuild it. Then Herod came in and renovated that temple. Didn't build a new temple, but renovated. Came one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And then that temple was destroyed. Barbara and Daniel not allowed to answer. That temple was destroyed when? Okay, I'm not a history guy as far as remembering dates. There's about 3 dates in history you need to know. One of them is 70 AD. Everything in the New Testament, you want to know where it's based on 70 AD, because 70 AD was when the temple was destroyed. So that's a big, you read anything about the background of a book, and it's 63, 64, 53, whatever it is, if it's pre-70, it means the temple wasn't destroyed. If it's after 70, it means the temple wasn't destroyed. And that's really what rocked the Jewish world, right? Because they said, this can't be destroyed. And so that's the second temple. Now, in theory, the next temple that we're going to see is the one where there will be the abomination of desolation, is how it's referred to in Daniel. Again, where there is a foreign god brought into the temple place. And so that's the third temple. And I have one thought on that I won't share. And then the question is, Ezekiel's is basically a fourth temple. And when would that be built? If it's a literal temple, built to the very detailed specifications that we read about in the book of Ezekiel, when would it be built? And many people believe that that's the temple that will be during the millennial reign of Christ, that temple will be there. Now there's some disagreement on that. A lot of people believe there's so much symbolism that so there's so much symbolism in Ezekiel. Is this a physical temple, or is it just symbolic? And so that's part of where the debate is on whether it's a real temple or not a real temple. And I think it's a lot of detail to be symbolic, but that's just me. Y'all know end times things is not my area of expertise, so I'm certainly not the one to ask that. And that leads to the second theological issue, is how do you interpret what Ezekiel's saying and trying to find the balance between literal and symbolic. So we take the word, we know the word, God's words. Word for word, it's exactly right. And so, is it literal or is it symbolic? That's why Revelation is such a challenge. What in Revelation is symbolic, what in Revelation is literal, and then trying to get that. So it's the same thing with Ezekiel, because it's so end times focused. It's hard to determine. So that's one of the theological issues you face in trying to interpret it properly, is trying to balance the proper balance between literal and symbolic. Okay, any questions? I find this fascinating, by the way. Book of Daniel, right? Pretty important book, crazy, one of the major prophets. He only does one video on it. There's a lot of books he only does one video on. Ezekiel is so crazy. I'm just telling you, crazy book. Ezekiel is such a challenge that he has 2 videos. So we've got 2 videos for Ezekiel.
The book of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest who had been living in Jerusalem during the first Babylonian attack on the city. And they spared the city, but they took a first wave of Israelite prisoners and hauled them off into exile, and Ezekiel was among them. So the book begins 5 years after all that, and Ezekiel is sitting on the bank of an irrigation canal near his Israelite refugee camp, and it's his 30th birthday, no less, the year that he would have been installed as a priest in Jerusalem. And then all of a sudden, Ezekiel has this vision. He sees a storm cloud approaching, and then inside the cloud are 4 strange creatures that have wings outstretched and touching each other. And these creatures each had 4 faces. And then he saw 4 wheels, one by each creature. And then he saw that the wings of the creatures were supporting this dazzling platform. And then on that platform is a throne. And then sitting on that throne is this human-like creature, glowing and shrouded in fire. And then all of a sudden Ezekiel realizes what he's seeing. He calls it the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. It's God riding his royal throne chariot. Now the word glory, in Hebrew it's kavod, it means heavy or significant. The biblical authors use this word to describe the physical appearance and manifestation of God's significance when he shows up in person. These images in the vision, they're very similar to what happened when God appeared on Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. And it's also very similar to the depictions of God's presence over the Ark of the Covenant. And that's actually the most shocking thing about Ezekiel's vision. What is God's glory doing in Babylon. It's supposed to be above the Ark of the Covenant in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the first section of the book opens to explore that question as Ezekiel begins to accuse Israel of rebellion. So God first speaks to Ezekiel from the throne chariot, and he commissions him as a prophet. Ezekiel is to accuse Israel of breaking their covenant agreement with God in a couple ways. Israel has given their allegiance to other gods and has been worshiping idols, and this has all led to rampant social injustice and violence. And so as a result, God appoints Ezekiel to warn the people. The first Babylonian attack that took Ezekiel into exile is going to be matched by another, and Jerusalem, its temple, all face imminent destruction. So Ezekiel uses words and more to get his message across. He also performs sign acts. These were a form of street theater. Ezekiel would go out in public and start behaving in these really bizarre ways that were like parables of his prophetic message. So he was supposed to build a tiny model of Jerusalem and then stage an attack on it. Or he was to shave off all of his hair and then chop it up with a sword. Or the most extreme, he was to play the role of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. And he would lay on his side for over a year, eating food cooked over poop, as a sign of the nasty food that people will have to eat during the siege of Jerusalem. And perhaps the most disheartening thing of all is the bad news God gave Ezekiel that no one was going to listen to him. Israel would reject him because of their rebellious and hard heart. And this recalls Moses' description of the people after the wilderness rebellions, when he predicted that exile would one day happen, and Ezekiel had the unfortunate privilege of seeing it all come to pass. And so a dismayed Ezekiel, he begins to perform his task. And after about a year, he has another vision. This one is about the temple. He goes on this virtual tour of the temple, and he sees what's happening there in his absence, and it is not good. In the outer courtyard in front of the temple, he sees this large idol statue. And then he sees the elders of Israel worshiping other gods, both outside and inside the temple. And then he sees the women of Israel. They're worshiping a Babylonian god named Tammuz. And the vision ends with God's glorious throne chariot moving up and away from the temple. It's leaving, going east, headed towards Babylon. And so in chapter 11, we come to see why and how God's glory appeared to Ezekiel there in Babylon. Israel's idolatry and their covenant violations, it's become so blatant and offensive that God has left his temple. They've driven him away, and he consigns it to destruction. But God hasn't abandoned his people. Rather, he goes into exile with them. And so at the end of this vision in chapter 11, God promises that he will return a remnant of Israel back to the land, and he'll transform them by removing their heart of stone and giving them a new, soft heart of flesh, so that they can love and truly follow their God after all. This is a small glimmer of hope, and it's quickly submerged under the reality of the imminent destruction. But chapter 11, it's a key transition, and it helps us understand how the rest of the book has been designed. So the next 3 sections are all announcements of God's judgment, first on Israel, then on the nations around Israel, and then on Jerusalem itself. But then after that, the hopeful conclusion of chapter 11 gets developed in the final 3 sections of the book. First, hope for Israel, then for the nations, and then for all creation. Chapters 12 through 24 focus on God's judgment coming to Israel. And this is a diverse collection of poems and essays. And here Ezekiel shows his fondness for parable and allegory. So he depicts Israel as a burnt, useless stick, or as a rebellious wife, or as a dangerous, raging lion that gets captured, or as 2 promiscuous sisters. These are all depictions of Israel's senseless rebellion and idolatry that results in their ruin. In this section, Ezekiel also acts like a lawyer. He begins arguing the case that, first of all, Jerusalem's destruction is truly deserved after centuries of covenant violation. And that even if the most righteous people in the world, like Noah or Daniel or Job, were alive and praying for God to spare Israel, God would not accept their prayers. It's far too late. And so God's goodness actually demands that he bring justice on this generation of Israel. The exile has become inevitable. They've reached the point of no return. Following this, Ezekiel focuses first on the nations immediately around Israel, and then on the 2 most powerful states in the region, Egypt and then Tyre. Israel has allied with these nations and adopted their gods and their idols. And so God accuses the kings of Tyre and Egypt for arrogantly viewing themselves as gods who get to define right and wrong on their own terms. And God holds these kings accountable for their pride, and he announces that he will use Babylon to bring them down. They will face God's justice along with everybody else. Following these really intense sections is a short story in chapter 33. Ezekiel's met by a refugee who's just arrived from Jerusalem, and he gives him the report that Babylon has attacked the city of Jerusalem, that the city has fallen, and the temple is destroyed. Ezekiel's grim warnings have become a reality. But remember, the end of chapter 11, that's not the end of the story. And so in the next video, we'll explore Ezekiel's profound vision of hope. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Ezekiel. The book of the prophet Ezekiel. In the first video, we were introduced to Ezekiel the priest, and he's sitting among the exiles in Babylon. And he's confronted by the awesome glory of God's temple presence, but it's appearing to him in Babylon. And then Ezekiel discovers why. It's because of Israel's idolatry and injustice that has compelled God to abandon his own temple. And while there is still hope for the future, the book went on to develop Ezekiel's message of divine judgment, first for Israel and then for the nations around Israel. And then a key moment happened in chapter 33. Ezekiel receives a report that the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem is over because the city has fallen. The temple is destroyed. Ezekiel's grim words of warning came true. The exile was the most horrendous catastrophe that ever happened to Israel, and it raised the big questions of whether God was done with Israel for good. But remember, at the end of chapter 11, God promised that there was still a future beyond exile for Israel. And so the rest of the book is designed to explore Ezekiel's vision of hope, first for Israel, then for the nations, and then for all of creation. The hope for Israel begins with God promising to raise up a new David, a future messianic king, who's going to be the kind of leader that Israel needed but never got. And this new Israel, who's going to come under the messianic king's rule, is going to be a transformed people. God's going to deal with the heart of their problem of rebellion by giving them new hearts. It's just like Moses promised at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. God says he's going to remove their hard hearts and send his spirit into his people to give them new, soft hearts that can love and obey their God. And this idea gets developed in the next strange vision. Ezekiel sees a huge valley filled up with dry human bones and skeletons, and God tells him that it's an image, a metaphor for Israel's spiritual state. So their rebellion against God, it resulted in exile and the literal death of many people, but it was also a metaphorical death of their covenant relationship. And God tells Ezekiel that his spirit is coming to bring his people back to life. And so this wind comes, and it causes all of the bones to stand up, and it fills them with breath and life, and then skin grows over the bones, and then all of a sudden Ezekiel sees all of these new humans standing in front of him. Now this vision, it's recalling the story about the creation of humans in Genesis chapter 2, where God made humans out of dirt and divine breath. And so Israel and all humanity have rebelled, resulting in death. And so the only hope is that God would perform a new act of creation and remake humans in such a way that they can truly live in a relationship of love with God and with each other. And so after God is going to deal with the evil that's in the hearts of his own people, some questions still remain unresolved. Like, what about the evil that's still rampant out there among the nations? And what about the future of God's dwelling place in the temple? And this is what the final two sections of the book are about. So first come chapters 38 and 39, and they promise God's final defeat of evil among the nations, which gets personified by a ruler who's named Gog from the land of Magog. Now, this name is derived from a genealogy of ancient kingdoms and lands from Genesis chapter 10, and it referred to powerful nations from the distant past. And so Ezekiel picks up this ancient biblical name as an image of any and all violent kingdoms. And so we find that Gog gets allied with 7 nations that come from all 4 directions of the compass, is clearly an image that represents all of the nations. And this also helps us understand why Ezekiel describes Gog with images that he used earlier in the book to describe the king of Tyre and the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. For Ezekiel, Gog is an amalgam of all of the worst, most violent people in the Bible. Gog is the archetype of human rebellion against God. The basic story in these chapters is that Gog resists God's plan to restore his people. And so just like Pharaoh in the Exodus story, Gog comes to destroy the people. But God unleashes his justice on Gog, and it's in a flurry of scenes that don't actually make very good literal sense if you read them in sequence. Because first, Gog and his armies are consumed by an earthquake, but then they're consumed by fire 2 different times, and then after that, God comes and strikes Gog and his army down in the fields where they lay unburied for months. It's clear that these scenes are full of symbol and imagery. Ezekiel has pulled out his entire poetic tool set here to describe how God is determined to finally defeat human evil that has ruined his world. And it's so that he can pave the way for a new creation. And so once evil is finally dealt with among the nations, the last section of the book describes how God's presence is going to one day return to his people and his temple to bring cosmic restoration. So Ezekiel first gets this long, elaborate vision of a new temple and a new city. He's given this heavenly tour guide who shows him around the new temple complex, and it's much larger and more majestic than even Solomon's temple. There's a new altar, new priests, a whole new system of worship. And then after this elaborate tour, God's glorious throne chariot that he saw back in his first vision comes back, and it enters the new temple. Now, the meaning of these temple visions has been the source of debate for a long, long time. So some Christian and Jewish readers believe that this vision will be fulfilled literally one day, and that these chapters offer the actual blueprints of the new temple that will be built when the Messiah returns and brings God's kingdom. But many other Jewish and Christian readers think that this vision, like all of Ezekiel's other visions, is full of symbols, and they depict the reality of God's presence returning to his people in the Messianic kingdom, but not necessarily in the form of an actual building. Whichever view you take, it's important that Ezekiel never calls the city Jerusalem, and chapters 47 and 48 show why. Ezekiel sees this tiny stream pouring out of the temple threshold and steps, and then it quickly becomes this raging river, and then it flows out of the temple and the city into the desert, into one of the most desolate places on planet Earth, the Dead Sea Valley. And then that river, it leaves behind it a trail of trees and life, and then the Dead Sea gets transformed into a living sea that's teeming with plants and animals. All of this imagery comes from the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And we see just how cosmic Ezekiel's vision really is. God's plan has always been to restore all humanity and all creation back to his life-giving presence. And so the book ends with the name of this garden city. The Lord is there. And so Ezekiel's visions come to a close, full of hope for a new future, new humans living in a new world that's animated by God's life-giving spirit. It's a world permeated with God's love and justice. And that's what the book of Ezekiel is all about.
All right, any questions or comments? Okay, let's pray. Dear God, we come before you tonight again to praise you as the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, to thank you for the chance we've had to get together. Lord, thank you that your word, though sometimes hard to understand, requires us to study, is your word. And so we know it's true, and we know it's important. And so God, I ask that as we do read or study Ezekiel in the future, that you give us a better understanding so that we can know you better, love you more, and serve you in a greater way. It's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Hal's not here to say ice cream. We're on vacation.
So